it's just an inherent risk that we have in this world that we're going to run into bad people. It happens all day long, every day. And they're trying to do stuff in our environments. And regardless of who it is, we need to be on our toes, because you never know. Like cybercrime groups can hit your company with ransomware. There's so many different attack methods that the browser is kind of a component in the process. And the browser, unlike EDR, where it has to watch everything on an entire device, it can be a very narrowly focused tool to help protect, watch, stay up with what's actually happening. We all don't have infinite budgets to be able to do everything we want, but there's often things we can do in terms of controlling our attack surface and just doing the basics. I would say that it's often that one server that we forgot about, or, we mostly patched something, but not completely, that ends up biting us. And I think if we collectively focus on that basic blocking and tackling, it's surprising how many things we'll stop or catch just by doing those things really well.
Hi, Travis. Welcome to Be Fearless podcast. Such a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I want to introduce you briefly to our guests. From oil and gas giants to renewable energy sector, you've spent over a decade securing some of America's most critical energy infrastructure. You're VP and CISO at Archaea Energy, where you're building security programs from the ground up. So would love to learn more. What led you to become a CISO? How did this whole journey start?
That's a good question. I get this question a lot, especially from people who are in security and have aspirations of becoming CISO or leading their own program at some point. And unfortunately, I don't have a perfect answer for that. It's not I don't know that I ever really had designs on landing a CISO and being, a CISO at a growing startup or any of that kind of stuff. It just kind of happened that way. I took advantage of a lot of building relationships as I, grew up in my career. And turns out those relationships become important later on, because those people grow and they get into big positions and then they put recommendations in or whatever. They call you and they're like, hey, I know about this thing and I think you'd be a good fit for it. And then you just talk and next thing you know, you're doing it. But I would say there's an awful lot of energy that has to be directed towards learning things along the way. And for CISOs, obviously security is a big piece of that, but security is not the only component for CISOs. I had to really kind of drink from the fire hose and learn a lot of things that don't really, they're not really directly security related, like understanding corporate finance and being able to understand, cash flow and, some of the mechanics of business, regardless of what vertical it is, whether it's energy or healthcare or whatever. And I had to really dig in and try to understand those things so I could speak coherently about that stuff as I moved into different positions. And those things ended up being very helpful in getting me into this role and being successful in this role.
Yeah. Do you think, would you be able to be where you are today without this adjacent knowledge that you just mentioned? Or is it part of something that everyone has to go through if they want to become a CISO one day?
I honestly don't know the answer to that. And the reason is that I think CISO, unlike other positions like CFO and COO and some of the other, big C-level titles, when you say CFO, everybody in the room knows what you mean. Everybody knows what that person's role is and what types of things they deal with and that kind of stuff. And when you say CISO, it really differs from business to business what that really means. It might be more or less a director of security equivalent from one company to the next. Or it might be a chief risk officer, in another company where they have the security title, but what they're really dealing with is a lot more risk oriented and, protecting their business, their company from risk. It just happens to be cyber related, but it's less of the technical chops and the other things that go along with other CISO roles, where they're deeply technical, setting strategy for how they're going to, defend against certain types of attacks and things like that. And some CISO roles just don't really deal much with that. Like, that's a very small percentage. So it really, the role itself is so different between one company and the next. It's just a case of letting your career lead you and guide you into the right roles that are a good fit for your background, your personality type, and everything else.
Wow, that's such an interesting answer. It seems like whoever aspires to become a CISO one day, they don't exactly know what it embeds. So how do you go about preparing for something that is so different in so many different companies? Do you see it becoming more standardized over years, or is it still very different across industries? Because it seems like with all the challenges happening today, with all the attacks, do you see it to be more standardized or not really?
I think so. I think some of the high profile legal cases that have happened in the last few years, and regulations that are coming out, and different education programs that are starting to come around geared towards training CISOs, I think that's all going to congeal into something that's more or less, maybe not cookie cutter, not as cookie cutter as like a CFO, but it should kind of congeal into something that's more or less similar from one role to the next, I think. But I also, I don't want to discourage people from obviously aspiring to be, CISOs and stuff. I think it's important to understand that it's not the same role from one company to next, like at all. And there's things that you can do as somebody who wants to get into that are kind of the same across the board. And definitely learning to reach outside of your security and even outside of your IT inside companies that you're working in, and beginning to understand and build relationships with people who work in operations, whatever your company's doing, and getting to understand their challenges, even if they have nothing to do with security. Those things will help you, understanding the mechanics behind maybe some of the economics and, suppliers and, supply chain things and other challenges that a particular company has, like understanding all those things while they may be specific to that organization. The expansion of your mind to that world is definitely going to help you in future opportunities that come along in other companies. So there's a lot of things that I think can be done. I don't think you have to be deeply technical to be a CISO, albeit there are probably some CISO jobs that are inherently require a certain level of technical acumen. It really depends on the business, but I do think that in a lot of cases, CISOs should at least have an understanding of what threats there are and that their particular business would face, and at least understanding them on a good enough level. They know the proper countermeasures for those things. And just like anything in security, being in security, especially being in security at higher levels, means you're always learning. Just the nature of the game. Yeah, there's going to be something new every day, and you got to figure it out, on whatever level. And, at CISO level, it's a lot more strategic, and understanding what strategic changes and decisions that you need to make to kind of make sure that your business is protected. But you still got to understand that stuff, at least on some level.
Yeah. Yeah, you really have to go into the weeds to understand the bigger picture of what you're handling and what you're doing. As you mentioned, like supply chain or anything that's related that actually helps to drive business value. All of these things are so interlinked. And we just talked about like different companies, and you yourself, you worked on so different scales from ExxonMobil to Archaea Energy. What do you miss and not miss about working in a large enterprise environment?
Well, there's a lot that I don't miss. I'll say that, nothing against former employers. Definitely made a lot of good friends there. People that I still run into even last week at Black Hat that I used to work with and stuff. So it's not anything like that. But I think big companies, man, they're just, they can be really daunting. There's always like processes and politics and things that could be in theory done quickly can't necessarily be done quickly just because of the scale. If you've got 100,000 endpoints, you can only do things that impact those 100,000 endpoints so quickly. That's just the name of the game. But some of the things that I kind of miss from those environments is just the resources, the immense resources that are available. And a lot of that's like people resources, like I knew people I could go talk to and find out answers to questions, and, we could put our heads together and come up with solutions to things. And, when you've got a small amount of those, you still do that. It's just you're doing it in a small amount of those, amount of people, like that you and the 12 people you work with, right? Versus like hundreds of people that I could reach out to in different parts of the business and get things and understand things. And it is kind of nice having that kind of power at your fingertips, and that you can just pull people up on Teams or whatever and have immediate answers and know that, you have people in other time zones that can be keeping an eye on things while you're sleeping and stuff like that. That stuff just kind of comes with the territory in those big giant companies that you may not necessarily have when you're, you and a few other folks in your team or whatever.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. And I'm just thinking, when it comes to being responsive to some of the bigger threats out there, how do you see bigger companies able to respond fast enough to all of this? Because as you said, there's so much complexity. How do you make sure you stay on top of your game while managing all of this?
Yeah, that's hard. It's really just a case of understanding what it is you're dealing with and where the real high risk stuff is. 'Cause most of the organization is not like critical risk, but knowing where the critical risk is, like these systems we can't really mess with, and these other systems, these thousands of other systems, it'll be hard, but we can push through and get those knocked out really fast. Like if it's a quick reaction type situation. But you also, again, you have all these resources. You have people in those regions. You have people physically at places that can help you and be hands-on, if you need to go to that level. Like, look, these are critical assets. We're going to have human beings standing there, and they're going to be walking through the process of patching or whatever the situation calls for. So it's really just a case of coordinating with the right people. Again, if you've got those relationships with others that you can lean on, that you've worked, been in the trenches with in the past, call them up like, hey man, we need some help. We're going to have to, roll up our sleeves on this one and, just make it happen. And stuff can happen, things like that can happen pretty quickly, even in big companies. It's just a question of being smart about it and talking to the right resources internally.
Yeah. How do you ensure compliance doesn't become a barrier to innovation, like in fast moving companies?
That's a good one, especially sitting in the CISO chair. It starts with being really smart about how you do your policies. And I don't mean making them super open and lax. I just mean understanding your world well enough to structure your policies in a way that gets you where you need to go, but leaves you with not too tight of a stranglehold on you that the slightest straying out of certain things, like, there's times in policy where you have to be that way. And there's times when you don't. And I think it's just being really savvy about how you navigate building out your policies, because that's what sets the stage for what happens when you have to deal with compliance a lot of times. Some of that you don't have a choice with, like, regulatory stuff. There's things that are in scope for SOX. You can do a little bit of like sometimes constraining that a little bit, but it's not as easy in the SOX world as it is to do that with like PCI. Like that's the name in the PCI world, is really limiting your scope. But you understand where the lines are drawn, and you just have to deal with it. Think ahead of time about, well, we want to do this. This is what we have to do to step up to this challenge internally. And here's some situations where compliance we may have to, proactively go in and maybe make some changes to policies or whatever to reflect the changes that you're trying to make. Like one example would be, what if you've got a password policy, and it's got all of the things in it, like, length, complexity, has to be changed every so often, all these things. and you move towards hardware tokens or something, and you don't even have passwords anymore, auditors are still going to come and ask like, well, what is your password policy? And it's like, well, we don't really use passwords anymore. Well, your policy says that you have this password policy, and everybody's expected to change the password. So in those situations, I think you really have to think about what is the goal of that policy, make smart changes to it that reflect reality of where you're at, and understand where you still have passwords, and make sure that it's scoped accordingly. Like, we're not getting rid of passwords completely. We still have service accounts. We still have these other things that use passwords. Well, let's make sure that that's called out. Like, how do we deal with passwords in those situations? And then just note that the requirement is that it's a FIDO2 supported, passkey or hardware token or whatever the situation is. And, whatever constraints you want to put around that, so that you are being secure, but that the auditors aren't confused as heck when they come and they take a look and they're like, what are we supposed to do here? Like, you have a really weird password policy and we're not really sure how to check what you're doing, so.
Yeah.
It's a long, drawn out answer, but it's just really about, I think, just being savvy and trying to make sure that whatever compliance you have to be beholden to, whether it's your internal policies in the case of auditors or whether it's regulatory stuff, really think about how to not constrain your team and IT in general for your users or any of that with what's going on there, Yeah,
it seems like compliance really has to go hand in hand with whatever changes you're doing when it comes to the tech side of things, because that's probably where misalignment happens, where they're like, as you just mentioned, the example of passwords, you made one change there, but it's not timely reflected in the other part. And that's where the challenges arise.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you've written actually quite a bit about APTs before. Have there been moments in your career where they crossed your radar?
So that's a hard thing to know for sure.
Yeah.
Just because attribution is really hard. Like, you can feel like oh my gosh, this was like so bad, and it had to be APTs, it had to be nation state,
Yeah.
And maybe reality was it was just some cybercrime guys that just really wanted to get after it that day. Like, it's really hard to tell. There's especially nowadays, I think, and there used to be a much easier to define lines between tool sets and techniques and stuff that threat actors from certain governments and stuff would tend to use or would prefer to use, and that would be like kind of a good way to say, well, there's a good likelihood that it was X or Y group, based on these tools and that kind of stuff, but nowadays, it's such a messy mess of some of the same stuff being done by cyber criminals and by nation states that it's really hard, So I don't know that I would want to go out there and say, oh yeah, for sure, we've bumped up, so-and-so APT group or whatever. But I can say for sure that I've run into Chinese actors, I've run into Russian actors, and in the past, and it is what it is. It's just an inherent risk that we have in this world that, we're going to run into bad people. It happens all day long, every day. And they're trying to do stuff in our environments. And regardless of who it is, we need to be on our toes, because you never know. Like, cybercrime groups can, hit your company with ransomware, and that's maybe worse than what the nation state was going to do when they came in. They were just maybe trying to establish a foothold or get after certain, information that they need for some other campaign or something. I don't know, but I've had some fun. I will say that my the funnest things that I've had in my career when it comes to like being toe to toe, like hands on keyboard with someone else that's hands on keyboard, it's when they don't know that you're watching, like suddenly the tables are turned and you're the cat and they're the mouse. And, I think that's a fun place to be. But I wouldn't want to find myself in that situation again, if you know what I mean. Because it's not something you can plan. It just like it happens, and then you're like, okay, we've got everything covered. We're good. We got, the risk of the company is covered to the point where we can keep an eye on this, and that's a rare situation, I think. And I don't know that I would actually want to do that now. I would just want to rip them out.
What would you advise person that just became a CISO for the first time and they're facing this kind of challenge? What kind of mentality adopt, or any suggestion you would give to them? What should they do if they're put in such situation? Because you can't, as you mentioned, you can't really prepare for it.
My biggest thing is as soon as you have a moment when you step into that new role, start planning at tabletop, playing exercises, bring third parties in to run the exercises for you so that some stuff can be a surprise to you. Yeah. Plan some yourself internally just to understand how to do those kind of things. And there's so many lessons learned that come from that. Those things will really, really help when something real actually happens. And there's not much you can do because like when something real happens, it never plays out like it did in the tabletop. But you at least should have an understanding of the tools in your tool belt that you can pull out and use in a given situation. And that's really what it's all about. And also just being calm. Like if you haven't built up those muscles to be in that situation, tabletops help you learn that. And it goes a long way to keeping you calm and being able to think a little clearly in a situation where it can be highly emotional, high stress, no sleep. The more you can do to prepare for that ahead of time, the better.
Yeah, you really have to have this solid, focused mind to go through all of this. And as we're speaking, you give such a calm energy that it's hard to imagine that you actually went through all of these scenarios, and right now you're just like as a reflection of whatever happened in the past.
It helps. I can say the actual events definitely help too, because like when you're actually sitting there staring at realizing like, okay, this is real, and then getting through it, I think being on the other side of it and being like, okay, we got through that. I think it helps give you a calm, the next time, even if it's something completely different and a million times worse. It is what it is. Like you can only control what you can control.
Yeah. And based on your experience across traditional and renewable energy companies, what security practices do you think the broader industry needs to adopt more widely?
Well, nowadays, I think we all need to be thinking about MFA and how to get barriers in place that are going to prevent session stealing, because the days of MFA being the catch-all solution to password theft and stuff are pretty much over. The way things are going the last, maybe 2 years, year and a half, threat actors are getting really, really good. And it's not just like nation state level. It's like even like everybody, like it's starting to trickle down into just your average run of the mill, everyday kind of cyber criminals. Are able to very quickly just take one click and come away with, a valid session token for one of your users. And they're now impersonating that user from somewhere else, like seconds later or minutes later or whatever. And I think we all as an industry have to be prepared for that and have to address it. The other thing is that, third parties are just as big a targets as we are, because that's an easy avenue into our organizations. And that one's a lot harder to deal with, I think, because at least with FIDO2 and stuff, you have a way to make session tokens not valid off of the device. Yeah. But with third parties, you have a trusted entity, and if they get compromised, you've already vetted them, they're part of your ecosystem. And even if there's not like a technical integration with them where they have direct access into your SharePoint or something like that, simply sending an email from their actual domain, and maybe even from a user in that domain that you've interacted with and with people inside your company, that can be very hard to defend against, because it's going to go past, right past all of your, security tools, all your email protections. And users are going to click on that stuff because it looks like it's a trusted thing. I'm supposed to click this link to get this invoice. Maybe it's just a case of invoice fraud and they're just saying, hey, change the banking details. But it could also be, hey, they now have Joe and accounting's, access, and then they're now getting into your bank accounts or, whatever. Able to issue invoices, and things like that, or issue POs and payment for stuff that they control, and stuff like that. So, I mean, it's scary. It's a scary thing. So, I think this is where the focus really needs to be across the industry, is on these big things like this that are the direction that the adversaries are taking nowadays.
Yeah, and it's very hard to imagine how do you even prepare your users, right? Like when it's something like unsolicited email from not known domain, like it does make sense. But if someone you interacted with, how do you even educate the user? Make sure to spot, I don't know, every single detail in the email, and with all people writing emails using ChatGPT, where everyone sounds
right.
how do you distinguish the difference?
Yeah, that's hard. And then the big challenge is too, I think a lot of organizations are using tools like, there's self-phishing, those tools are not set up to impersonate your own suppliers. And I don't even know the legalities of, like if I went to my legal department, I'd be like, hey, we need to, act like we're so-and-so, like, is that going to get us into legal trouble or something, Yeah. So it puts us in a really hard place, because how do you educate the users well enough, and obviously getting them to see it and practice it is one good way, like using our self-phishing programs. But there's some nuance to that I think has to be considered if you're trying to impersonate actual other companies that you do business with, have legal paperwork with. It's tough. It's tough. Yeah. That's what the bad guys are doing. They don't have a legal department. They don't care. So.
Yeah, it seems like it is a proper muscle that needs to be trained. I just don't know how to exactly define it, but sometimes when you receive something, it just feels odd whenever, let's say, your company renews insurance, and then you look at it and you're like, okay, you go and ask 5 people before actually checking, okay, is this legitimate? So I'm sure it is a muscle that needs to be trained across whatever industry, whatever company size. Yeah, and then it's just becoming more and more complex. And today, as more users spend more time on the browser, and most people call it right now the new endpoint, how does browser security fit into energy industry, and what does it look like in practice?
Well, I don't know about the energy industry in general, but I think holistically, just looking at the landscape of what's being done, what are bad guys doing, what tools do we have on the security side to bring to bear against those things. EDR is still useful, but despite it being basically anything that goes on the endpoints, it does feel like the actual browser is kind of a more precise tool to use against a lot of the attacks we actually see. Because when you think about it, if it's a phishing email, they're clicking a link, or they're opening a attachment that maybe has a link that's probably going through a browser, right? And if it's a drive-by, they're doing it in a browser. If it's like there's so many different attack methods that the browser is kind of a component in the process. And the browser, unlike EDR, where it has to watch everything on an entire device, it can be a very narrowly focused tool to help protect, watch, stay up with what's actually happening. Where is this link coming from? Where is it going to? It came from the email client. Okay, that's interesting. Where's it going to? What's the infrastructure on the other side of this? There's a lot of things that I think you can do with that specifically that make the browser kind of a natural place that we should be at least considering security options for, in my opinion.
Yeah, and what sort of attacks do you think frequently underestimated by a lot of people in the industry that take place there, and then people should pay closer attention to?
Well, the two that really kind of come to mind, one we already talked about, is the session stealing. Just a quick, easy, dirty way to become and impersonate somebody that has access to things. And I think the proliferation of SaaS as part of the internal infrastructure of companies, whether you still have a data center that you host a lot of stuff internally or not, I guarantee the company has SaaS stuff that they're connecting to. So that, so those things, they either become a door into the organization, because now with that session token, what do they have access to? Can they get into 365? Is it a Microsoft shop? And they now can access OneDrive and SharePoint remotely. Is there a VPN that's tied to SSO and they can just SSO their way into the internal infrastructure with that wonderful session token? The other things that I think I don't know if it's necessarily on the rise, but those of us who defend against browser stuff all the time, like we know about the Chrome fire drills that happen almost weekly, because there's like some nasty RCE, remote code execution exploit that's in the wild, so it's like you're patching against something that you may have already dealt with, you may have already seen in your environment. And so in the way people don't understand, that don't really follow the inner workings of these things, is that it's rarely like a single exploit nowadays that an attacker is using. Like when they click, like when you click something and your browser gets exploited, it's usually a chain of exploits, a chain of things that are happening that end up with them gaining control. They may be a man in the browser, where they're now in the browser and they can see everything basically, which sucks again. Like if you're doing SaaS and everything else, like all that stuff is now on the table for the bad guy, So I think it's just the nature of the beast. That's, attackers go to the, lowest hanging, like they don't want to have to do really hard things if they don't have to. And if there's easy ways to do stuff, they're going to choose the easy ways. And if we're in browsers all day and there's exploits, there's pathways for them to get what they want.
Yeah, you're right. It's just going for the lower hanging fruit and seeing what is the bigger attack surface out there and what is the best strategy I can use to bypass few solutions here and there, make sure it's not getting flagged by anyone.
Exactly.
Yeah, we saw multiple examples where you're a technical user or not a technical user, you're still super vulnerable to these kind of things.
Unfortunately, even us who've been around the block and know things, we do stuff that's risky sometimes, like, oh yeah, that's Joe sending me a meme, and then I hit it, and next thing you know, it's not actually Joe, and that's not a meme,
Yeah. Yeah. I don't want for memes to ever stop, but unfortunately,
we need those.
Yeah. You've been a speaker at so many conferences. What's one message you consistently try to get across to fellow security leaders?
I think it's really just pay attention and be creative. You don't always have to have the coolest whiz-bang thing that's at RSA or Black Hat. Not that there's not value in those things, but we all don't have like infinite budgets to be able to do everything we want. But there's often things we can do in terms of controlling our attack surface and just doing the basics. I would say that it's often that one server that we forgot about, or, we mostly patched something, but not completely, that ends up biting us. And I think if we collectively focus on that basic blocking and tackling, it's surprising how many things we'll stop or catch just by doing those things really well. And I think that's the best summary I can come up with for, all that stuff.
Yeah. And your career, brought you where you both managed and build up teams ranging from small groups to entire SOC teams. What's the biggest leadership lesson you learned all these years?
For sure, it starts with hiring, and don't ever shortcut yourself on hiring ever. Like every time I've done that where it's like, good enough. Yeah, it's a lot of times that comes back to bite me. So as much as we can, I think making the best of every position that we have the ability to hire for, and hiring the very best humans that we can find within the constraints of our business. If they've got to be on site somewhere, then you're limited to people in that region, and, do the best you can, and hire for culture as much as you're hiring for technical capabilities. I made mistakes there too, where, absolutely fantastically smart people that know whatever subject matter extremely well, just really weren't, a good fit with the team. And that ends up being a bigger problem than the actual problems I'm trying to solve by bringing them in. So I think it starts with hiring, take that very seriously, and then take really good care of people and trust them. If you have gone out of your way to hire the best people, like give them the tools to do their job and get out of their way, and just be there to support them and lead by example. Don't tell them that they have to work on the weekend and you're out playing golf the whole time. Not that there's directly anything wrong with that. It's, be in the trenches with the guys when you got to be in the trenches, I think is really what I'm saying. There's times when as a leader, when this is a big deal, and I'm not going to leave the big deal to my buddies, this guy that works for me's shoulders. I'm going to be in there with it, with him, and I'm going to help him understand how to deal with these situations and transfer that knowledge and capability as best I can. Those are opportunities more than anything, and we have to see it that way.
Yeah, because each of these little instances where potential distrust is created, it's much harder to rebuild back than actually be in a place where you consistently maintain it. And then in the long term, everyone is fighting the same battle. So you want to be as aligned as possible.
Very well said.
We have this little tradition, Travis, on our podcast where our previous guest would ask questions to the next guest. So our previous guest asked the following question. If there was one mindset or philosophy that helped you lead through uncertainty, what was it and why?
I don't know if it's really a philosophy, but over and over again, I've been in situations where we're in the war room, for instance, and we've spun something up. And I think our human nature wants to lead us towards the worst possible scenario in those situations where, oh my gosh, it's some nation state, and it's like never a nation state, it's like, some misconfigured server doing something that nobody understands, and turns out it was you the whole time, it was something you did. And I think the lessons that I take from those things is the simplest answer is most often the answer. It's not some complex scenario that you can concoct in your head of, well, maybe they did this, then this, then this, then this, and managed to get here and all that. No, probably super simple, probably the most obvious thing staring you in the face that is probably the situation. So I don't know what you call that philosophy, but
don't overthink.
Yeah, just don't overthink. Yeah, that's probably the best way to put it.
Yeah, I think all of us would like to assign a certain level of importance of whatever task we're trying to accomplish and think, okay, the rest of the world should just watch me trying to solve this problem. And then, as you mentioned, sometimes it's just a smaller mistake, a forgotten server, as you mentioned, somewhere in the back that needs to be fixed.
Exactly. Those are very good learning exercises, though. So take them for what they are.
Yeah. What question would you like to ask to our next guest?
The question I like to ask people is, so you're X, maybe it's a CISO or whatever. What do you think is going to be the next step for you? Because in my case, it may not be CISO at all. I don't know that I necessarily want that title in the next role. And so I'm curious, is that me, or is there, do other people think that way too? And they think, what? Yeah, maybe I do want to do something that's a little off the beaten path from what I've been doing, Yeah,
it's a good question. And I think a lot of people are thinking about it because you reach that point where most people wanted to get, and now you're there and you're thinking, okay, what is next for me? And there are so many paths. There is joining a company, becoming a CIO, so opening your own advisory, so many things. So it would be interesting to see. And I think at the end of the day, somebody mentioned this to me over another podcast, but the real trait of a leader out there is how many other leaders they're able to create along the way.
1,000%.
It will be like while whatever is coming next, it's all about what kind of mark you leave behind.
Yep.
Yeah.
And there's a lot that goes into it. I mean, we're all in our own spot in life, and we are not, like Travis Farral is not defined by CISO. Like there's a lot more to me than just this security guy that does this job, and we're all that way. We're all this conglomeration of a bunch of different things, parents, fathers, brothers, friends. Maybe we have roles and different things outside of, outside of work and everything. And so it's up to us, we have to keep all those other things in mind and kind of find that balance, whatever that is.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Well, Travis, I really enjoyed our conversation. We've covered so many topics. I'm just like digesting them all in my head as we speak. We spoke about what's it like to work in a smaller company, bigger company, energy industry, non-energy industry, what kind of mindset you're supposed to adopt depending on where you choose to become a CISO, what's coming next after you become a CISO, how you handle the most emerging threats out there. It's just so many topics for anyone who's thinking of entering this industry or scaling up. And I think a lot of lessons for our audience.
Well, it was a lot of fun. I appreciate it. The line of questions was very thoughtful, and I think your responses were very thoughtful. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.